G'day, I'm Yuki-san Dev, and in part 13 of this series Unity for the Absolute Beginner, we will be doing a little bit with custom functions. Alrighty, so in our game 1 that we just finished, we used a few custom functions, but today we're just going to briefly go over functions in general. We'll cover private and public, void functions, functions with return values, with parameters, and calling functions from within another function. So let's get into it. So what is a function? Well, in programming, it's arguable what a function really is. It kind of depends on how it's being used. They also go by many different names as well. But at this stage, as a beginner, just think of them as stored procedures in a little package that can be called when needed. Functions in the beginning are nice for keeping things tidy and also minimizing code for repeated actions. So let's start off with the void function, since we already used a few in our first game. So void means that it returns no value. It's just a set of instructions that will be carried out when called. Good for buttons, for example. So let's make a script and a button to get the ball rolling. Right-click in your hierarchy and select UI and Button Text Mesh Pro. And if you need to, import TMP Essentials and close. I'm just going to leave my button as is, but I am going to change its text to Click Me. Maybe get into 2D mode and double click your canvas to get a better view. And I'm just going to center my button here so that its position X and Y are 0. Also going to turn off skybox in my camera. And change projection to orthographic. And zoom my game window in a little to make things easier to see. Alright, now click in your project window and create a new C# script, and let's name it functions. Now we need to attach the script to something in the scene or it won't run, so create an empty in your hierarchy and name it functions. And drag your function script onto it. Cool, we're ready to go. So double click your function script to open it. Alright, so first off we can delete our update method for this one because we will not be using it. We are going to create a function that can be used by our button, so right before the last curly bracket in the script, let's do public void test button. And then in between the curly brackets type in debug.log. And speech marks, you click the button. So the public makes it accessible outside the script. It needs to be, otherwise our button wouldn't be able to see it. Void, as we mentioned before, returns no value, and test button is the name of the function. So let's save this and get back to the editor. Now click on your button and scroll down until you see the on click. Click the plus sign and then drag your functions object from the hierarchy into here. Then select no function and then functions, and you should see the function we created called test button. Now run the game. Click the button and it runs the function, which was to say you click the button. Cool. Alright, let's do another function with a parameter this time, so back into the function script. Let's make a new function below our test button, type public void test input, and then in between the brackets put our parameter string player name, and in between the curlies put debug.log, hi there in speech marks, and then plus player name. So this one is expecting a string when it gets called, and it will assign whatever is in the string to the local player name variable and then print it. So let's save this and get back to the editor. Right click on your canvas and select UI and input field text mesh pro. I'm just going to leave the default name for this one. We need to move it so that it's not covering our other button. Scroll down in the inspector until you see on end edit string. Click the plus sign and again drag your functions object into here. Then select functions and test input up here. Not the one below, otherwise the string will be null. And play. Enter something in the text field and press enter and it will run the function to say hi there and whatever string you typed in. Cool. So in this example, the function received its value from the input field. But if you remember in the game we just made, there was a function that received its value from another script. It's done pretty much in the same way, just by calling the function and sending the parameter to it. The parameters can be all sorts of things like strings, int numbers, floats, bools, etc. Right, now let's do a few functions with return values. So let's get back in the script. Alrighty, so for something totally impractical and silly, let's say I just wanted to display a random number. So I would type in something like debug.log random between 0 and 5 is plus random.range 0, 5. And I'll just copy this and paste it below and change this to second random number between 0 and 5. Okay, so that's going to work and it will print two random numbers, but since I'm doing the same thing twice, I could just get the random number for both of those lines from one function. So below the test input function, let's do private int random integer, and then in between the curlies put return random.range 0, 5. And now replace our random range statement on those two lines up here with random integer and empty brackets. So we have created a function whose sole purpose is to return a random number between 0 and 5. The function is not void this time because it is designed to return an integer to what called it. In this case, our two debug lines are calling it and each will receive a random number. So at this point, you could save and play if you like. I'm going to carry on. Now, can you send parameters to these two? Yep, of course you can. So let's do another function. Private float random float, and in between the brackets, float A, float B. And in between the curly brackets, type in return random.range A, B. Then change one of your lines above to call the new function with the parameters. And let's do it between 0 and 10. So this line is now calling the random float function and sending two parameters to it. Those parameters are being accepted into two temporary variables a and b. Then it returns a random number between a and b values. All right, let's save and run. Cool, there's our values. Also notice the float number contains decimals because it's a float. So far these functions are all very basic, but at the beginner level they are just supposed to give you an idea of what they do. Let's see now. So how about we make a function to return something else like a set of vector coordinates to spawn something at. So let's just quickly make a cube in the hierarchy and reset its transform. Rotate it a little bit. And halve its size. Okay, now drag it into the project window to create a prefab. And now you can delete it from the scene. All right, let's get back into the script. Alrighty, so let's add a reference to that cube. So below the class curly bracket, type in public game object cube. Then in our start method, type in instantiate cube. This will of course create a copy or instance of that cube in the scene. Alright, let's save this and back to the editor. Now click on our functions object in the hierarchy and drag our cube prefab into the cube GameObject field. Now the script knows what we're talking about when we say cube. And run. Cool, it's spawned in our cube. Now the cube was spawned in at the same position that we created it. Let's give it a new position. So back into the script. So let's put the spawn coordinates in a return function. So make a new function, private vector3 spawn pos, and in the curlies, return new vector3 5, 5, 0. Then add to our instantiate line, comma spawn pos, comma cube dot transform dot rotation. So our new spawn pos function will return the vector3 coordinates when called. The instantiate line is creating the cube at the coordinates from spawn pos, and we're leaving the cube's rotation as is. You could save and run now if you like, but I'm going to carry on. So I want this cube to spawn in a random place each time. So I'm going to alter the function a little bit. So let's make a couple of local variables for the range in which this cube can spawn. So let's put float cube x equals 9.5f and float cube y equals 4f. This should keep the cube within the game view. And then return new vector3 random dot range minus cube x, comma cube x, and comma random range minus cube y and comma cube y. Cool, so this should now spawn the cube in a random position each time you run the game. Let's save this and give it a try. Yep, it looks pretty random. Alright, let's get back into the script and do something a little clever. So our vector3 function is creating a new vector at a random spot. But we already have a function in the script that can get a random float number between two values, random float. So we should just use that. So let's do return new vector3 random float and then send it the parameters minus cube x and cube x, comma random float, and send it the parameters minus cube y, cube y. So we just called a function from within another function. Let me just move this function up here so it's a little easier to see what's going on. Well, we have our instantiate line that is creating a copy of the cube in the scene, and it's calling on the spawn pos function to get where to put the cube, and the spawn pos function in turn is calling random float to get some random numbers between the values that we sent. After spawn pos gets what it needs, it returns the full vector3 back to our instantiate and the cube is positioned. So in this script we have used one function to perform twice for different code sets. Our debug used it and our instantiate line used it. Now just to be a bit of a dork, I'm going to add one more. I'm going to get my cube to keep spawning. So I'm going to create another function, private void spawn my cube, and drag my instantiate line into the curly brackets. Then in start, type invoke repeating, and my function name in speech marks, spawn my cube, 1, 2. So this is going to run the function spawn my cube every 2 seconds. So the function flow is now looking something like this. Not the most practical way of using functions in the script, but it's just to show you how they work. One other little tidbit, you can click on the references above the functions to see what is using them. If you click on our random float function reference, you can see that the debug line and the spawn pos are using it. Okay, let's save this and run. Cool, it's working. Totally pointless, but it's working. Now, of course, there's a ton more to functions than just this, but this is good for now. We will tap into them more at a later stage. Have a play around and see what other types of return functions you can make. Just remember too that a function can do pretty much anything that a normal script can do. You can have conditions in there to return different values depending on conditions, if statements, etc. You can also return more than one value from a function, and I was going to cover it, but at this beginner stage I don't think it's necessary, and there are a few ways to do it, so it probably would warrant another video anyway. So let's recap today. Righty, so we printed a random number between 0 and 5 from the return value of a function. The function was private because only this script is using it. We also printed a random float number between two values that we sent to a function to compute and then return using parameters. Again, private because only this script uses it. We created a simple void public function to print something when a button is clicked. Made public because we needed the button to be able to see it. We created a function to be called when an input field is complete. The function received the string from the input field and printed it. And we created a function to spawn a queue prefab, which in turn called another function for the vector, which again in turn called another function to get the random numbers to help complete the vector. I didn't call a function from a second script because we already did this in game 1 and there will be many more functions throughout the series anyway. So in the next video, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm thinking to go over a few different ways you can make a background scroll. There are a stack of ways you can do it, and you'll find a lot of game developers will argue about which way is better. Since this is a beginner series, I will show you a couple of simpler ways to do it to get you started. These videos are sort of a preset of items possibly for our next game. So I hope to see you in the next video.